Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of Byzantium, episode 287, Count Baldwin of Flanders and Hainaut.
The city has fallen.
The city has fallen.
Once the Latins had emptied Constantinople of its movable wealth, it was time to get down to business. The business of annexing the Roman Empire. Before they had even taken the city, the Crusaders had agreed what would happen when they did. Abandoning the cause of Jerusalem, they managed to convince themselves that conquering the entirety of Romania was their new sacred duty. I think we can all agree that bringing these heretical Christians into line and under the Pope's authority is now our number one priority, and the best way to achieve that is to steal all their land and divide it amongst ourselves. Only as their new landlords can we properly correct their foolish ways. Agreed? Agreed. Jokes aside, it's interesting that the Latins intended to take over the whole empire, rather than dividing it up or dispensing with its norms entirely. I think this was driven by the Venetians, who had gambled heavily on this mission succeeding, and couldn't risk the Byzantines returning to power and taking revenge. It also suited the ideological fiction that the reunion of Eastern and Western churches was a serious motivation for the Crusades' volunteers. They didn't plan on running things exactly as the Romans had done, as we'll see. Their intention was probably for the empire to operate in a similar way to Outremer, with different regions run by different lords, but with one leader who they all ultimately owed allegiance to. The formal agreement reached in their camp before the sack looked like this. Once the city was taken, a committee of 6 Venetians and 6 Crusaders would elect a new emperor. If a Crusader was chosen as the new Vasilevs, as was expected, then a Venetian would become the new Patriarch. The former would receive the imperial palaces at each end of the city and 1/4 of all Roman land. Then a second committee would convene, this time made up of 12 Venetians and 12 Crusaders, to agree how to dish out the other 3/4 of the land. Finally, everyone swore to remain in Byzantium for another 12 months in order to consolidate their control over the empire. The leadership were well aware that many of those who'd taken vows to travel to Jerusalem were keen to get home, as were the Venetian sailors. But if lots of people left as soon as New Rome was sacked, then it would be impossible to establish control over the empire. So, once the city was taken, it was time to have an election. It would obviously be one of the leaders of the crusade who would be chosen to become the new emperor. And since the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was blind, in his 90s, and the head of another state, it clearly wasn't going to be him. Technically, the leader of the Fourth Crusade was Boniface of Montferrat, and he certainly thought the position should be his. The Italian had been a driving force behind the diversion to Constantinople, and he had family history here. Both his brothers had held the rank of Caesar, and he was now in pole position to go one better. The other leading noblemen were all French: Baldwin of Flanders, Louis of Blois, and Hugh of St. Pol. The election that followed went against Boniface. The Marquis of Montferrat quickly realized that he was going to be frustrated. You see, the Crusader contingent was dominated by men from France. That's where recruitment for this campaign had been centered. Boniface had only signed up later, when the original leader of the venture, Thibaut of Champagne, had died unexpectedly. So of the 6 Latin electors, at most 2 were going to be Italians, the rest were French, while all 6 Venetian electors, whatever their official protestations might be, were going to vote the way Dandolo wanted them to, and the Doge did not want the Marquis of Montferrat. Boniface was in his 50s. He was an experienced political operator who was already being hailed as Vasilevs by some Byzantines who remembered his brothers and expected him to rule. Montferrat is also just up the road from Genoa, one of Venice's only maritime rivals. There was every chance that Emperor Boniface might court the Byzantine people or the Genoese to suit his own ends, neither of whom the Venetians could trust. Whereas a French emperor would have no such connections and would be more likely to honour the agreements they had all made back in their camp on the Golden Horn, an agreement which included the proviso that no power at war with Venice would be admitted into the empire, a veto which would allow Venice to keep the Genoese and the Pisans out of Byzantine harbours. Dandelo's interactions with the other leaders led him to believe that Baldwin, the Count of Flanders and Hainaut, was the right man for the job. Baldwin was born around 1172 in Valenciennes in northern France, making him just 32 at the time of the Fourth Crusade, a much more pliable figure in Dandelo's eyes. Baldwin's family had many Crusader connections, so he took his mission seriously, and everyone who wrote about him, including Choniates, acknowledged that he was a genuinely pious knight, faithful to his wife, brave in combat, and a good leader. He was clearly the popular choice amongst the French contingent. He already had children back home who would inherit his lands there. His wife was on her way to New Rome, and his brother Henry was on crusade with him. So, he seemed ready for the challenge, willing to settle in these new lands, and well supported by his family. He was in no way a Venetian puppet. He may well have won the election anyway, but his respectful and deferential tone towards the Doge impressed Dandolo, and so the committee did not take long to deliberate. It was announced to a huge crowd on the 9th of May that the Count of Flanders was to be the new Roman Emperor. A week later, Baldwin was led from the Great Palace to the Hagia Sophia to be crowned. The Latins employed many Byzantines in their new administration, who doubtless organised the coronation. But the Crusade leaders had all been present when Alexius Angelos was enthroned 10 months earlier, so they knew what the ceremony was supposed to look like. Baldwin took off the clothes of a knight and put on imperial robes and the red leather boots which marked out a Vasilevs. He entered the main body of the church and made his way to the altar. He was then anointed, as kings were in the West, before a crown was placed on his head. He was also decorated with a huge gemstone which had belonged to Manuel Komnenos. He sat on a throne for the rest of the liturgy, holding a scepter, before being led out of the church on a white horse. He returned to the palace to sit on an ancient throne which the Latins believed had belonged to Constantine I. There he feasted his men before presiding over chariot races and some jousting in the hippodrome. The Westerners were attempting to ape Byzantine practice with a few tweaks of their own in order to legitimize their rule. They had to get the quote-unquote Greeks on board if they were going to make this work, so it was best to present Baldwin as just another Roman emperor who would respect the traditions of men like Manuel and Constantine, a figure who the local population should bow down to and obey. The second committee now got to work dividing up the empire into fiefs for those who'd risked their lives to capture such a great prize. A quarter of the empire belonged to Baldwin. His lands included much of Thrace, as in the approaches to Constantinople, which made sense. The other 6/8 of the empire was divided equally between the Venetians and the Crusaders. There was one major problem with this division, of course. None of this land was actually in their possession. It was all very well swapping territories like trading cards, but you do actually have to go and capture it all if you want to collect its revenues. So that was next on the agenda. Various groups of Latins and Venetians headed in different directions, depending on where their assigned lands were, and began a conquering. Spoiler alert, but this is essentially why the Latin Empire was doomed to failure. The Fourth Crusade was not actually a big enterprise. There were a lot of sailors present, but the fighting troops were small in number. If they'd behaved like a true Roman army and marched around the empire as one, they might have been able to hold it together. But by splitting up in that acquisitive way that the Latins were wont to do, they diluted their strength. The Emperor Baldwin decided to march for Thessalonica. This would allow him to tour his Thracian lands and secure their surrender, while also making sure that the empire's second city was brought into the fold. This was a sensible plan to make use of what was left of the summer of 1204. As he led his men out into Thrace, most towns surrendered quickly. The shell-shocked Byzantines were in no position to resist. Troops were trained to hold cities until the emperor arrived to relieve them, but with Alexius Angelos Komnenos gone off to Greece, Baldwin seemed to be the only game in town. So gates were flung open, and Baldwin was able to make ceremonial entrances into many a Thracian city. This pleased the Latin leadership, as they were able to make friendly contact with the local Byzantine aristocracy, whose support they would need to keep the peace. It was on this march that Baldwin's agents found the blind Mourtzouphlos, who was dispatched back to Constantinople for judgment and execution. When the Vasilevs arrived at Thessalonica, the city's leaders came out and offered their surrender with a few conditions. They were terrified that the Latins were here to visit on them the same punishment they had just meted out to Constantinople. So they said they would happily accept a Latin garrison and governor if the emperor would confirm them in their privileges. Presumably this meant local office holders would maintain their rights and no new taxes would be levied. Baldwin was happy to oblige and respectfully stayed in his camp. The only hostility felt during Baldwin's march was from Boniface of Montferrat. The Marquis, disgruntled at his election defeat, had asked to be given Thessalonica in compensation, but Baldwin refused, pointing out that the committee had assigned those lands to other people. He was similarly short with the Byzantine aristocrats he met during his journey. Many of them attempted to curry favour with the new emperor and asked if he would appoint them to various governorships, but again Baldwin said no. He had to make sure all his supporters and the Venetians received what was owed to them. He couldn't yet assign lands to the locals, or it might create a mess. In both cases, this meant trouble. Boniface threw a huge strop, as we'll hear about next week. The Latin leadership acted quickly to put a stop to this conflict, and in the end, Baldwin appeased Boniface by giving him most of Greece, including Thessalonica. Meanwhile, the Byzantines were less than impressed with their new overlords. As Baldwin warmed himself by a fire back at the palace, the Romans spent the winter talking sedition. The officials who'd opened their doors to Baldwin felt they had no choice. With their patron, Alexius Angelos Komnenos, gone, it was not clear who they owed their allegiance to, and they had one eye on the Bulgarian border. The revived Bulgarian Empire had dealt the Romans blow after blow during the past 2 decades, and the Tsar, Kaloyan, had taken advantage of the arrival of the Fourth Crusade, sending raiding parties into Thrace and seizing forts south of the Haemus Mountains. Most of the Romans there hated the Bulgarians. They had been suffering from their attacks for a generation now. So despite the sack of Constantinople, many Byzantines were willing to welcome the Latins in if they could protect them from their northern enemy. But now doubts were growing about the quote-unquote Emperor Baldwin. He'd refused to embrace the local Byzantine aristocracy. He'd given no assurances that they could keep their lands, titles, or salaries. The tiny garrisons he'd left behind filled no one with confidence. As you know, the Crusaders didn't have that many men to spare. The commander Renier de Trie, for example, occupied Philippopolis, a city of thousands, with just 120 knights. They would all have had attendants and squires and so on, but for smaller fortresses the Latins were probably sending 20 to 100 men only. It was not an intimidating occupation. Roman men began to think, what if instead of joining with the Latins to fight the Bulgarians, we joined the Bulgarians and annihilate the Latins? Conflict seemed inevitable, so we might as well pick the winning side. The Tsar had spent some time in Constantinople. He was not an entirely foreign figure. It was a high-risk strategy, but some even pondered whether Kaloyan would make a better emperor than Baldwin. War with Bulgaria was the last thing the fledgling Latin Empire needed. But unfortunately, the new Vasilevs had already alienated the Tsar. Kaloyan wrote to Baldwin after the sack, in friendly terms, offering some kind of alliance in exchange for land. The Tsar had recently accepted the Pope's authority, so this seemed an ideal moment for the Latins and Bulgarians to stand over the corpse of Byzantium and embrace one another. But the Latins seem to have inherited all the Roman prejudices against the northern kingdom, seeing the Vlachs and their Cuman allies as barbarians, unworthy of normal courtesies. Baldwin informed Kaloyan that all imperial territory south of the Hemus was his, and that any Bulgarians found squatting there would be removed. In February 1205, a Roman rebellion broke out in Thrace. It was centered on Adrianople, where Byzantine soldiers slaughtered their Latin garrison and invited the Bulgarians into the country. Several nearby forts followed suit. Greatly alarmed by this, Baldwin put out a general call to arms and marched north as quickly as he could. This was another mistake. Not only were Boniface's men off in Greece, but many of his own troops, including his brother Henry, were over the water in Anatolia, trying to capture the fiefs that had been assigned to them. Though they responded to the call, Baldwin did not wait for them to catch up. Instead, he and the Doge each led contingents north to snuff out the rebels. 2 Thracian towns surrendered when the Crusaders approached, and at Arcadiopolis they encountered some of the Tsar's Cuman allies and drove them away. A swift, direct response was the Latin way, and it seemed to be working. Baldwin and Dandolo arrived at Adrianople at the end of March. Adrianople was the largest fortress town in Thrace and the prime recruiting ground for Roman foot soldiers. The Latins threw themselves into the siege with typical enthusiasm. They began to undermine the walls and were so focused on their siege works that they seemed unaware that the Tsar and his army were approaching. Kaloyan was wary of the Latin threat, but when his scouts informed him of the numbers he faced, he began to relax. The Latins had perhaps a couple of thousand men, while the Bulgarians may have had double or even triple that number. They also knew the terrain back to front, while the Latins were fresh off the boat and distracted by their siege. Kaloyan sent in his Cumans to skirmish with the enemy and try to draw them out of their position. He was very surprised at how easy this proved to be. On the 13th of April, the steppe riders approached the Latin encampment and peppered them with arrows. Baldwin's knights eagerly chased them away, pushing their mounts hard in a fruitless pursuit as the lighter-armed nomads dashed back to the safety of their camp. Intrigued by the recklessness of their actions, Kaloyan decided to test Crusader resolve the next day. His Cumans repeated their tactics exactly, even retreating from the onrushing Latins along the same road they had used the day before. Baldwin urged his men on, determined to get to grips with the nomads. In one-on-one combat there was no doubt who would emerge victorious, but that's why you don't chase men from the steppe. They have no intention of giving you what you want. With the Latins exhausted and strung out along the road, the Tsar led his army in to surround them. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, one of the crusade top brass, wrote afterwards about the horrible scene. Knights were cut down in their hundreds. The Latin instinct was to stay and fight and prove your bravery, but they were by now a disorganized rabble, and many began to break away from the fighting and ride back to Adrianople, a shameful act in Geoffrey's eyes. He describes it as flying back to camp, and in a rather moving line he concludes, quote, "There on the field remained the Emperor Baldwin and Count Louis, who would never fly. The Emperor was taken alive, and Count Louis was slain." Horrified and shocked, Dandolo organized a retreat under the cover of darkness. As the Latins made their way south, they ran into the reinforcements they should have waited for. Our historian Coniates does not crow at this Latin humiliation, because, as he notes bitterly, it merely left the field open for the Cumans to terrorize the native population. Robert of Clary, a Latin knight, wrote that it was punishment for the Crusader leaders holding back treasure for themselves after the sack of Constantinople. It was certainly an unmitigated disaster for the new Latin Empire. The Bulgarians ran riot in the aftermath. Their alliance with the Romans saw most of Thrace throw off Latin control. The Crusaders held barely half a dozen forts by the end of summer. And worse was waiting for the Doge when he returned to Constantinople. It had been a year since the sack of the city. The Crusaders' vows had expired. 7,000 pilgrims were loading their possessions onto Venetian ships and preparing to sail home. The Latin leaders harangued them for abandoning the enterprise in its hour of need, but the rank and file had had enough. They had been lied to and manipulated, forced to sack Christian city after Christian city in the name of a crusade. They were homesick, and they were leaving. In desperation, the remaining leaders wrote to the Pope to beg for reinforcements. A year after their glorious conquest of New Rome, the Latin Empire seemed moribund. As for the Emperor, no one knows what became of him. The most reliable sources suggest he was taken back to Turnovo and kept as a somewhat honoured guest. But 12 months later he was dead. Kaloyan wrote to the Pope simply saying that he died in captivity. Perhaps he'd suffered wounds on the battlefield. Perhaps he was executed. Coniates claims he had his limbs cut off and was thrown into a ravine for the birds to chew on, though that has the air of a Byzantine revenge fantasy. The Latins agreed that he was gone and chose a new emperor the following year. But not everyone could accept this. 19 years later, a man living alone in the forests near Valenciennes was recognized as the long-lost Count of Flanders and Hainaut. The emperor had returned home. People flocked to see their long-lost lord, and though various physical and behavioral discrepancies were pointed out by those who'd known Baldwin, these were easily dismissed. He had been a prisoner and vagabond for years, trapped amongst Greeks and Slavs. No wonder he seemed different. Could it be that Baldwin, guided by God, really had survived and returned to his homeland to restore justice? Sadly not. The fake Baldwin was executed the following year, but such was the legend of Baldwin, Count of Flanders and Hainaut, the first Latin emperor of Constantinople, that it took a long time for his memory to fade.